So welcome everybody for being here. I'm Reinhard Zeidler, a member of the steering committee, New Hampshire's Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. And so as we move into the legislative season, I think some of us may feel like the workings of state government may be tend to be a little bit opaque, shall we say. And it's kind of legislation is sort of a sausage making process, I guess. What are some of the mystery ingredients? That's kind of basically what we're wondering. We might be a bit nervous to find out the answer, but to be honest, but knowledge is good for democracy, and hopefully it's also good for the environment. So we're very pleased to welcome an expert guide with us to help us navigate the highways and byways of New Hampshire's legislative processes. And I'll just briefly introduce him in a second, but first, as always, let's takes place in Ndakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor the land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Ndakina throughout generations. And if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat, and hopefully we'll get to them toward the end of the hour. And now let me briefly introduce Jim O'Brien, our guide for tonight, to the NH State House. Jim's been Director of External Affairs for the Nature Conservancy New Hampshire chapter for about 13 years. In this capacity, he oversees the chapter's climate and energy program for work, as well as marketing and communications, is staff lead on the trustee policy and on the development and communications committees. He's responsible for overall strategic direction and implementation of TNC's state and federal government relations plan. So he has a unique insight into the workings of the state government on matters of conservation, energy, and environmental policy and politics. And Jim is currently serving on the Hopkinton School Board. He served for 12 years on the Hopkinton Board of Selectmen, most of that time as chair. And my first question for Jim is that correct? Did I get those years right? Because I've heard a couple of different versions, but you've definitely been serving for a long time on those bodies.
Close enough. I think that's great.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ron Martin, and thank you for the invite. So I'm excited to be here and to talk about something I've been doing for what feels like a very long time is lobbying and working in the State House for conservation purposes. So I'm going to walk through a series of slides, not too long, more to set sort of a framework and a little bit of process. So we're all, I think, on the same page and speaking similar language. And then really, I hope, and I think the most value from today will really be questions and answers and conversation that we can have and really speak to what's on your mind. So I'll try to move through my slides rather quickly, and then I was given a series of questions to answer off the top, which I'll run through as well, and then we'll save plenty of time for everybody's questions, comments, and conversation. Reinhard set up a little bit of my background, but I thought I would share a few other items. And as I was putting this together, I felt, well, one, I felt old because a lot of these dates happened long ago. But the other reason, this is sort of like, the back of a baseball card through some of the stats. And so I put this up, really to show and to share, I really come at this with a pretty broad background in sort of lobbying, government relations, both at the state and at the local level. So I am a New Hampshire native. I grew up in Manchester. And I went to UNH in Durham. And really, when I was in college, I guess I was bitten by the political bug. I volunteered for campaigns. I started and ran the UNH College Republicans. And then immediately coming out of UNH, I started working on political campaigns, both state level campaigns, some federal campaigns, some local campaigns. did a little bit of everything. I had a consulting shop for a little while. And then I had an opportunity to start working in the nonprofit sector. And I moved my way into an executive director position with a startup organization. It was originally called the Granite State Conservation Voters Alliance, which is a mouthful. And so that was shortened to Conservation New Hampshire. And that organization was, it really married politics, elections, and lobbying into one nonprofit. It was a League of Conservation voter affiliate. And so really that was my first time doing conservation work. Really my job was to work with a coalition of environmental organizations here in the state, put priorities, bills forward, and then lobby elected officials to try to pass those priority conservation bills. The organization also had a PAC and a 501c4, and so we did direct election, and so we endorsed candidates, we did scorecards, and then we ran independent expenditures to help elect candidates with strong environmental backgrounds and point out to voters candidates who do not have such stellar records. And then around that time, I was asked by one of my neighbors if I would be interested in running for a local, the local select board. I'd never been to a select board meeting in my life at that point, and I said, sure, that sounds like a great idea. And so I ended up serving on that board for 12 years. I served as chair of the Hopkinton Select Board for 10 years. And early on in that transition, there was a job opening at the Nature Conservancy here in New Hampshire. The Nature Conservancy was one of the organizations that I worked really closely with when I was at Conservation New Hampshire, really respected the organization and the work that they did. And so I came on as Director of Government Relations in 2011. In 2013, I was promoted to External Affairs, which covers our government relations program, both state and federal, but also an emerging climate and clean energy work in our marketing and communications. In 2018, I ran and was elected to the Hopkinton School Board. And so for a year, for some reason that my wife does not understand at all, I served on both the Hopkinton Select Board and the Hopkinton School Board. And then, which my term, this is my 6th year on that board, and my term is up in March, and I am not running again. So it will be my first time in about 18 years in which I won't be on a local governing board, which is pretty amazing and I'm pretty excited about. And then in just this last year, I was promoted to be deputy director here at the Nature Conservancy, still overseeing our marvelous and fantastic government relations program, but taking on a more strategic role here in the chapter. So all that by way of background, really just want to show that, I have a lot of experience lobbying here at the State House. I have a lot of experience working within the municipal government. And then a lot of my job has also been working with our congressional delegation, among others. So this is a little bit of a commercial for the Nature Conservancy, but I hope the next couple of slides will help you understand, the policy work that we do and why we think it's really valuable and important to, across the board. So first, the Nature Conservancy is a global environmental nonprofit organization. We currently operate in almost 80 countries. This is 70 plus, but I think we're getting close to 80 countries. If there's an environmental issue across the globe, the Nature Conservancy is probably working on it, from ocean issues and marine issues to energy, clean energy. We are a science-based organization. We have more than 400 scientists working on staff. We're mostly known for land protection, but we do so much more than that. A few years ago, the organization set some very ambitious high-level goals moving towards 2030. Really, these 2030 goals are designed to help us meet the dual challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. And why I put this up and why I think it's important is, with the Nature Conservancy, as we set these goals and as we go about doing our work here in North America and across the globe, policy is a key part to our strategy for how we'll actually advance and reach these goals. Because policy is such a huge lever. We can all take individual action on our own, but policy is a main lever by which you can start to make change at scale. And we can see that in what we're trying to do here in the State House. More funding for state agencies, more funding for land protection will equate to more land protection and more environmental outcomes. So we see at the Nature Conservancy policy as a large lever, and we invest heavily in it. We have people like myself in all 50 states here in the U.S. working in our State House and working with federal delegations to move policy issues forward. So when we think about our policy approach here in New Hampshire and further our federal work, we have sort of 4 buckets of work that we're engaged at. I mentioned biodiversity crisis as being one of our dual challenges. And so as we look at legislation and policy to move forward, really how do we save biodiversity in nature? We do that through funding and policies that support effective conservation and management outcomes. We're really investing in nature and to clean energy. And so you see a lot of the work that we're doing with partners is really, how do we bring more clean energy onto the grid, both here in New Hampshire and across the country. We are working to adapt to climate change. We just announced here in New Hampshire a couple projects, I think it's 5 projects that we received a large grant for over on the seacoast to fix some undersized culverts. And so our work is on policy. Well, our work is both on the ground, so we do on the ground projects, but we also bring funding to those projects through our policy work. And then finally, we work really hard to defend foundation, conservation, and environmental laws. This is really a no rollback provision. Every year, both here in Concord and at the federal government, there are legislation and attempts to roll back some of our foundational laws. And so we work with partners to see no rollback of those environmental laws. So that's a little bit about the Nature Conservancy and sort of how we see policy as a main lever. But one of the questions that I get asked a lot whenever I tell people about the work I do is, what is a lobbyist? What do you do? And so I looked at the New Hampshire RSAs to see how they define lobbyists. And so I highlighted a few words here that I think, at least from the state of New Hampshire, how they define the work that I do. So first, it's really any person who is employed. And so when we think about a lobbyist here in New Hampshire, it's a person that is being paid, who's being employed in a representative capacity for a person or an organization to promote or oppose legislation. So that's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to understand. But I think being a lobbyist goes further than that here in the state. So there is legislation, but we also work with other levels of state government, especially the governor and council, and really any state agency any state agency. And so the lobbying that the Nature Conservancy and many other organizations and nonprofits undertake is really multifaceted. It's with almost all levels of state government. And then the types of lobbyists, there are nonprofit lobbyists, like here at the Nature Conservancy, at New Hampshire Audubon, and other nonprofits. There are industry lobbyists, and you can imagine they come from across sectors, from outdoor recreation to electric industry. And then there are lobbyist firms. So these are almost like lawyer firms or legal firms. There are firms set up with multiple clients. A lobbyist will represent multiple clients in front of the legislature, in front of the governor. And so as of last year, there were 421 registered lobbyists here in the state of New Hampshire. So almost a registered lobbyist for every member of the general court. And not all lobbyists are full-time. There are some lobbyists who register who may never show up in the State House. There are some lobbyists. I'm still a registered lobbyist, although my day-to-day activities are no longer taking me to the State House every day, but I still partake in influencing of legislation. I still go to meetings, and so I am a registered lobbyist. I'm being paid by the Nature Conservancy for influence. Lobbyists play a big role, and we could talk more about this, but we play a big role in drafting and shaping bills and legislation. In Concord, we get to wear a very nice, stylish orange badge. And so if you're at the State House and you're wandering around, you'll see different color badges, but the lobbyists are the ones with the hunter orange ones. So you could always find your lobbyist if you need to. And all lobbyists, you have to register, and those registrations are transparent and open. So you can go to the Secretary of State's website and you could find a list of all lobbyists and who they're registered for. So you can, I believe you can still do this. You can search by name and get the affiliations, or you can search by organization and you can get the lobbyists who are registered to represent them. And then all lobbyists are required to file quarterly financial reports, and those are also available on the Secretary of State's website. They are, I would say they're pretty basic. So they ask for some basic financial information. So you don't get a lot of company secrets or trade secrets from those filings. But they do provide information for the general public. If you're interested to see how much lobbyists are being paid by clients, you can discern some of them information from those quarterly financial reports. So the next couple slides, I use that definition of a lobbyist. So as someone who works in who influences in the legislature, the governor, and with state agencies. And so I'm going to talk about each of those a little bit, sort of what they look like and what that means. So the first is the New Hampshire legislature, which is probably the first place you think of when you think of a lobbyist, is that they're influencing legislation. So most of you already know some of this, but New Hampshire has one of the largest legislatures in the world. There's 400 House members, and right now the members are almost evenly divided by party affiliation. So we have about one elected House member for every 3,500 people in New Hampshire. When I talk to others across the country, colleagues of mine across the country, this is probably the single most astonishing fact that they hear. Most state legislatures are much smaller by matters of degree. And so thinking about how you influence and lobby 400 House members is really a challenge. Our Senate, on the other hand, is much smaller. It's only 24 members with a 14 Republican and 10 Democrat split. A much more manageable body in order to get to know members, build relationships with, and influence. All members in the House and the Senate are paid $100 per year plus mileage. And so, $100 doesn't go as far as maybe it used to go. But really, being in the legislature is a volunteer job. There is a small stipend, but you're really working with volunteers who are elected for 2-year terms. And I would say, almost all of the reps and senators I've met over the years, they are doing this as a volunteer, but they really take it seriously. This is much more than a normal volunteer job. You're signing up for something that's pretty intense. It's 6 months. Usually the sessions are 6 months long, from January to June-ish. And if you're signing up to be an elected official, either in the House or the Senate, you're at the State House a lot. Senators, are mostly there 3 days a week. House members, sometimes that much. And so, these are volunteers, but I think the dedication that they're showing by running and holding these seats, it's more than a volunteer job. Another reason it's more than a volunteer job is because our legislatures really do not have staff members. There's some legislative staff, like at the Office of Legislative Services. That's sort of a legal office that helps write and draft bills and legislation for lawmakers. The committees have some staff, mostly shared staff among committees, and then leadership has some staffers. But especially for House members, there's not a dedicated core of staff who are helping research bills, providing lawmakers with answers to questions or their own research. And so really House members and senators are on their own devices to do the research and find the information that they need in order to move bills forward. And so what's the process look like? So this is another maybe oddity in New Hampshire that most other states don't have, but that every bill that's introduced into a legislative session has a public hearing and is voted on the floor of the House or the Senate. And so, each session can have as many as 1,000 bills that are filed. And so those 1,000 bills each get a public hearing and then get a vote on the floor. So in New Hampshire, unlike other states, a committee chairman or the Speaker of the House can't just sort of kill a bill. They can't put it in their desk drawer and hope it goes away. These bills have to move through the process, which I think is good. It's transparent. Every idea gets a hearing. People get to have their say. But what it does mean, it's sessions tend to be pretty chaotic. There's a lot of information. Things move pretty quick. If you're trying to move 1,000 bills, through one chamber, things get pretty tied up and hectic. And so you gotta really pay attention and be on top of things. And then, our sessions are broken into 2 years, and so they're biennial sessions. And so normally, if a bill is heard in the first year of the session, and it gets killed, the legislative rules say that bill cannot come forward. So in most cases, in many cases, but I'll just say a bad idea in session 1 isn't repeated in session 2. But there's always workarounds, and sometimes topics come back up even after they've been soundly defeated in the first year of biennium. So I mentioned, after a public hearing, the legislature will vote on all bills. And so the committee makes a recommendation to the floor. And so if you're in a committee and are part of an executive session, you'll see that, someone will make a motion on a bill. And so the motions are normally ought to pass or ought to pass with an amendment. That's OTP. That means the bill, as it sounds, ought to pass. And that's the recommendation going to the floor. Bills can also get an ITL, which stands for inexpedient to legislate. That's a fancy, nice way of saying this bill should die and is not recommended by the committee. And then there are, bills that can retain or refer for interim study, which in many ways is a nice, it's a nice way to keep a bill moving. At times, if it's a good idea, but the language of the bill, there's not a majority thinking this is ready for prime time. A lot of times they'll set up to retain the bill to work on it further or for interim study, to keep the issue alive, to keep building momentum or to keep bringing information to lawmakers to be able to make a more informed decision. And something that we are seeing more now because of the divided numbers in the House is a no recommendation by the committee. Usually that's a tie vote. The committee can't come up with a recommendation, so the bill will go to the floor with no recommendation, which then sets up a floor fight in the House, which in a lot of times really depends on who shows up that day at House sessions. With 400 members, you're always going to have some absences, people who can't make it, who are sick, who are traveling. And so especially in now in the legislature, who's coming on session days is very important to some of the bills that pass or don't pass. And then all bills must pass or be heard or be voted on the floor by something called crossover. Crossover is the midpoint of the session and usually occurs in March. And so if your bill makes it through your committee, gets voted on the floor with an ought to pass recommendation, it goes through crossover, and then pretty much that bill that started in the House would cross over to the Senate, and the bill that originated in the Senate would cross over to the House. And then the whole process starts over again. There's a public hearing in that new body. Amendments can be put forward, and then the committee makes a recommendation. Finally, if a bill makes it through both houses, then the governor gets to either sign or veto it. A few other things to pay attention to. First is the biannual budget process. So here in New Hampshire, we do our budget every 2 years. And so the budget goes through every odd year. And so, you know, and like most things, budgets are a big deal. And so the budget process every odd year really takes a lot of energy, a lot of thought, a lot goes into it. And so it preoccupies many lawmakers and agencies. You know, our state agencies must get legislative approval of their budgets. And they also need to seek legislative approval for funds that aren't in their budget, like federal funds that may come in off budget. And then, you know, the legislature likes to establish subcommittees, you know, on interim study bills to look further. They like to set up study committees and commissions really on issues that have a lot of stakeholders, are pretty complicated. They'll set up these separate committees to track and follow and keep working on these bills, which lobbyists need to stay on top of and understand the moving parts. So that's the legislature. That's sort of the process. That doesn't get into how a lobbyist moves between all these, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So the next space that lobbyists are very active is with the governor and executive council. So if you follow New Hampshire politics at all, you quickly realize that our state government and our governor is pretty weak in terms of other governors here in the US. And some of that weakness is because of a powerful executive council. This is a form of government that was set up during the colonies, and it was really a check on the executive branch, so having a council that served as a check on a powerful executive. Here in New Hampshire, we've retained that structure. There's a few other states that continue to have an executive council, but they've removed many of the powers that our executive council still has. So we have 5 executive counselors here in the state. They're all elected and they serve 2-year terms. So their districts, if you think one legislature, one House member serves about 3,500 people, and there's 400 of them. So 5 counselors have a much larger geography and population to serve. Probably the main, this is probably not true. One of the main things the council does, and probably one of the most important, is that the council has to approve all state contracts over $10,000. There are a lot of contracts the state puts out over $10,000, and so you know the council has a real strong say in how our state you know expends resources and who those resources go to. And then if there are money that's, especially federal money, that's not currently in an agency's budget that comes forward, the executive council approves before the state agency can accept and expend those funds. So the council meets bi-weekly in public to review these contracts. And if you go to an executive council meeting, you'll see that the audience is filled with our state agency heads. You know, our commissioners are really expected to appear at council meetings to answer questions. A lot of times on the contracts that the council has before them, but sometimes commissioners get asked all sorts of questions on any topic, and they're there to answer them for the counselors. The counselors do more than just do contracts, though. They approve appointments of judges and commissioners and other high-ranking officials. Here in New Hampshire, you know, another place that we have a weak governor is that our appointees, especially our commissioner appointees, have terms that are longer than the governor's 2-year terms, which can give them some autonomy. And then, I think if you're a new governor and you come in and all your state agency heads have been nominated by your old governor, you have some work to do in order to build relationships to move your agenda forward. So a lot of New Hampshire state government is set up to be very slow moving. It's not set up to be to do big, huge things at once, but to make slow, incremental progress. And I think as a lobbyist, this is one of the things I learned early on is that, slow incremental progress is the way that New Hampshire fashions our policy. It's an interesting thing. If you haven't seen, there's something, it used to be published and it was a red book, which is how it got the term red book. But there is a publication that you can find on the Secretary of State's website that's updated very frequently that tells you all the terms of over 300 citizens who serve on various agencies, boards, and commissions. And so if you're curious who serves on the aquatic mitigation board, you could go to on to the Secretary of State's website, find the red book, and see the appointments of those people and when their terms expire. If you're interested in serving on a board or a term, that may be one of the first places to look. And then the council has other duties. One of the ones that I always found interesting is that the council runs something called GASSET, which sets up which sets the 10-year highway plan. So the council starts that process. They have meetings across their districts in order to hear projects, transportation projects that come forward, and then the council helps put forward with the Department of Transportation the 10-year state highway plan that then goes to the legislature for approval and funding. So finally, sort of the third leg of the stool here are state agencies. So state agencies engage in a lot of public policy through their rulemaking authority, as well as how they implement and enforce existing state statutes and regulations. So state agencies run the day-to-day operations of state government. They're charged with implementing the statutes that are drawn up by the legislature. And they have their own authority around rulemaking and how they interpret these statutes. And so something that we could talk more about is that, when we think about state agencies, we want them to do more. And we always want our state agencies to be very active in the legislative process in enforcing laws. And we know that they are limited both in their fiscal capacity, especially here in New Hampshire, but also in their political constraints for how they operate and how they do their work. At the Nature Conservancy, we work with state agencies, I would say every day across our portfolio of projects. They have expert staff across their agencies and how they do their work. They're a source of a lot of information. And they also show up in the legislature. A lot of times they don't take positions on bills, but they'll definitely share ramifications of certain pieces of legislation that are coming forward. What would it mean for their agency to have to implement? A lot of times there's a cost to agencies to implement laws, and so the agencies are pretty straightforward for what those costs are. And I would say, the legislature, for the most part, pays attention to the opinions of state agencies. I think as a lawmaker, you don't want to put your agencies in a spot where they can't implement your idea or they don't have the resources to do it adequately. So that's a little bit of like a very high level run through of the process, at least that we pay attention to as lobbyists here in the state. And so before we hop into your questions, comments, I was given a series of questions, the answer off the top. And so I'm gonna walk through these. I think there's like 8 or 9 of them, which will hopefully help spur some thoughts and questions for our conversation. So the first question I was asked is, how do I learn about issues? And I hadn't actually really thought about this too much until I started to think about this question. And so, um, yeah, it comes from a lot of places. And so, I spend a lot of time. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, which may be an awful thing to say, but Twitter does provide. There's a lot of people on that outlet that I follow that have a lot of great insights into the workings of the legislature and the policy. Um, I have an exceptional team here at the Nature Conservancy of experts in issues that that really bring issues to the forefront that we want to be working on as an organization. And then my colleagues across the environmental community here in New Hampshire also bring forward a lot of topics that they see or are interested in. We have, and I know the network is part now, we have a monthly meeting called the Environmental Roundtable, where those advocates from across the environmental community come together and share information and talk about what issues are important. And then, outside of the environmental community, being on local governing boards, you hear a lot of what is a concern to municipalities across the state, and so there's a lot of inputs, and I would say the last one is talking to our members, talking to our donors, talking to our trustees, really getting a sense of what's bubbling up out there. At least for me, is one way. So how carefully do I plan what to say? So I took this as, how carefully do we plan what we say when we are testifying? And so maybe I'll use this opportunity as a question to talk about maybe some of the ways that lobbyists interact with decision makers. And so, carefully do I plan to say testimony-wise? I would say yes, that we, as a lobbyist for the Nature Conservancy, I'm representing the organization and the values and the opinion of the organization. I'm not representing the opinion of Jim O'Brien. It would be great, and it usually is pretty great when my opinion and the opinions of the organization overlap. But as a paid representative of an organization, I'm representing their interests in front of the legislature. And so I am careful what I am to say. We are fact-based and science-based, and we're as lobbyists and as organizations who are in front of the legislature. We may disagree with lawmakers on one issue, only to be back the next day with those same lawmakers on an issue that we agree with them on. And so a lot of our this is to say we're very careful that we know that we're very careful not to burn bridges, because we know that we're going to be working with these lawmakers, these stakeholders, these agency reps for years to come, and so we want to have and continue to build a good relationship. That's not to say we don't disagree, and we don't offer opinions and facts that are counter to theirs, but we really try to do it in a respectful way in order to move a discussion forward. And then I would say, so that's one way. So testifying in public, that's one way that we represent our interest to lawmakers. We also do it individually, one-on-one, and so we may pick up the phone, call on weekends, send emails, and those a lot of times are more conversations than they are one-way testimony. We're trying to express our opinions, but also trying to better understand the point of view of where those lawmakers are coming from, which is very important to be able to do. So I think I covered that one. I would say we plan a lot. We really carefully plan what we want to say to get the best points across. So I put these two together because they felt pretty similar. How often do legislators seek out lobbyists for advice? I would say quite often. And one of the things I brought up in the slide about the legislative process is, here in New Hampshire, our legislators don't have their own staff to call upon, and so lobbyists have a lot of information and a lot of information to share. Many lobbyists in the state house um, have been active for a while, and so they've seen bills come and go, or they've understand the process. And so I would say, legislators seek out lobbyists a lot. We are experts in our field, in our fields that we represent. Um, and then I would say for lobbyists, a lot of us are not very knowledgeable of the legislative process, and so our advice is often sought on a variety of topics. Um, And then how much influence the lobbyists have versus public input or versus party affiliation. And there's no, I would say there's no rule to this. This really depends a lot on the lawmaker and how much faith and stock they put into the advice and influence a lobbyist has versus members of the public versus their own party. It depends on the lawmaker. It depends on the issue. It depends on the timing, what the question is. And so there's no real way to answer this. It's one of those great, it depends. But I've often found, that the group that has the most influence with decision makers are their constituents. As a lobbyist, lawmakers know I'm paid to represent a point of view. But their constituents are the ones who live in their town, the ones that see them at the grocery store, the ones who have known them, and the ones who vote for them. And so I would say that their constituents have a very high level of influence over their elected officials, and which is influence that I don't think this is going off script a little bit, but I think this is an influence that I think many of us don't use as much. If you talk to a lot of representatives in the House, most of them don't get a lot of public input on bills that they hear. And I know that's true from the elected representatives in my town. And so, the more constituents reach out to have conversations with their elected officials, the better, because you would think that they get, they're inundated with public comments from constituents. And, on some issues that's true, but I think on many environmental topics that just isn't the case. And so picking up the phone, reaching out to your elected official does pay dividends. Can you have legislators as friends? Yes, I hope so. I think there's a joke that everybody's gonna eventually serve a term in the New Hampshire House with so many elected officials. But yeah, I have close friends that are legislators. I think both lobbyists and lawmakers have ethical standards and rules in which you govern yourself by. And so there's no reason that a House member or a senator and then a lobbyist can't be friends. You work together in the state house, as long as you're abiding by those clear lines and those ethical standards. There's no reason not to have legislators as friends. They're good people too. So this one again, I bundled together. So how many different legislative areas might a lobbyist be covering? And so some of this depends on the type of lobbyist you are. So I sort of laid out a few at the beginning here. So I work for the Nature Conservancy, and so I cover and lobbyists that work for us, cover clean energy, environmental issues, things that you would imagine, budget issues concerning the environment. In most, I would say industry and nonprofit lobbyists, really cover a sector, generally in issues pertaining to the sectors. When you get into firms, lobbying firms, it's a little different because, like a lawyer, a lobbyist who works for a firm will have multiple clients, and they may cover multiple sectors. So they may have an environmental client, they may have a healthcare client. and others. And so, contract lobbyists could, depending on the lobbyist and their capacity, they could have a half a dozen different clients across sectors that they're working to cover those issues in the bills that those clients are paying them to represent. And so how does a lobbyist acquire clients? So I think, for contract lobbyists, it depends. I would say so we retain lobbyists. So we have our own in-house lobbyists, and then we also contract with some contract lobbyists from time to time. And so how you acquire clients, again, it depends. Some of it depends on the relationships that the lobbyist has. Some lobbyists have really strong relationships with Democrat elected officials or Republican elected officials. And so if your issue needs more of one than the other, then you might choose a lobbyist based on that. Some lobbyists have long and deep expertise on certain topics. If you're looking for a healthcare specific lobbyist, you'd probably go looking for a firm that specializes or has a deep level of experience and knowledge in that sector. And then, there are general lobbyists and general practitioners and advocates. There's sort of every flavor of lobbyists that you might want or need in order to move your issue or bill forward. And so there's 400, I think I had 412 lobbyists. And so there's probably someone out there that meets both your values and the issue that you're working on. And as all lobbyists are required to register with the state, you can find all their contact information on the Secretary of State's office if ever you're looking for a lobbyist. Have I suggested legislation? I would say I wouldn't be a very good lobbyist if I have not. So yes, we have worked with lawmakers to put forward bills. We have worked with lawmakers on amendments. We've worked with lawmakers on study commissions. We served on committees and commissions. And so we are an active participant in the legislative process. Think lobbyists do not sponsor bills. We work with lawmakers who then sponsor bills. But lobbyists ourselves, we don't get to walk into legislative services and get a bill written on our behalf. So it's really, we're there to support legislation. A lot of times we're there to support a legislator who is trying to work on a bill. We use our opinions and expertise to help guide some of those processes. But lobbyists are not able to put a bill forward for consideration in the legislature. This is a great question. How do you measure your success? Yeah, there's a lot of ways to measure success. And so one of the things you learn early on, I think, in doing this work is that, as a lobbyist, you're not a decision maker. You can influence the process to a point, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the elected officials who are going to put the bill forward and who are going to vote on it. And so, measuring your success based upon how many bills that you work on move forward or die, I don't think is the right way to measure success. So a few others that I would just put forward. One is the relationships that you build. I think, like many things in life, especially lobbying, it really is about relationships. And so it's who takes you at your, you want to be taken at your word. You want to be putting forward facts that are defensible. And so I think a strong measurement of success is to lawmakers return your call, to lawmakers invite you to meetings, do they come sit with you, did they take your advice? I think those are measures of success because you're building long-standing trusted relationships, which is really a foundational key to being successful in the legislative process. And then, another way to measure success, I think, is the process itself. It's really measuring those things that you can control. And so as a lobbyist, you can control, did you show up for the committee hearings? Did you provide written testimony? Did you provide oral testimony? Did you follow up on lawmakers' questions that you know the answer to? Did you follow up with your colleagues to get more information to the legislature? So those are all things that we can control as lobbyists. And I think if you do those parts of your work well, you're going to build those trusted relationships that you want to have year over year moving forward. And I think those successes will then turn into legislative successes over time. How long are my days? 24 hours. I think the same as everybody else's. I think because sessions, really go from January through June. So those, I would say the January through June is pretty intense days, especially, as we cover a lot of hearings, we cover a lot of committees. I think your days are very exciting. I think Meredith, who I know is on this call, who's a lobbyist in the Nature Conservancy, will attest her days are very exciting. But you never know what's going to come up. There's a legislative calendar, so you do know what committees and what bills you'll be hearing. But that doesn't really tell you what your days are going to be like, because you're going to run into colleagues from other organizations who are going to have information to share about a bill that's moving along. You're going to run into lawmakers or state agencies who are going to want your help on bills, or going to want your advice. You're going to talk to lawmakers. So those 6 months are pretty intense. You're working pretty long days. You're working into the night. And then when the legislature is not in session, you're still working with your state agency partners. You're still attending study commissions, and so there's still a lot of work that happens in between sessions. There's still a lot of work that happens even when there's not legislative sessions that keep you busy. And then, this is sort of the big catch-all. What goes on behind the curtain that is useful for the public to know? And I just want to go back to kind of what I said a little bit earlier, which is I think members of the public can have real influence, constituents with their elected officials by picking up the phone and talking to them. I really do think it's kind of behind the curtain. But I really do think that is one of the most influential things that can happen, is for constituents to reach out to their elected officials, let them know who they are, and engage them in conversation. And that's a lot different than engaging them in hard advocacy or twisting their arm on a bill, but really engaging them in a conversation as a constituent. I think has a lot of benefits, both to your advocacy and how you position yourself and move forward. But also you gain a lot of insight into how a decision maker thinks, how they respond, and how they act. And because everybody in Concord is elected every 2 years, your advocacy voice can grow beyond just that one issue, but you can talk to your neighbors and friends in your town and let them know how that elected official responded to your input, to your advice, and to your outreach. And so you really can make a big difference and a real impact through conversations with your elected officials. So I think that yes, so that's sort of the end of my slideshow and the questions I was put to me. So I'm really interested in hearing questions or thoughts that you all have. Here's my contact information. I know that Susan and Reinmar have it, so they can also share it with you if you have more questions. If you want to engage in a conversation, please reach out. My door is always open and happy to engage and to share whatever insights I might have with you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to hand it over, I think, to Reinmar. If there's questions or comments, I'd be happy to to answer them.
There are some questions on the chat. Let's see, probably more than we have time for, but as usual, but we will do what we can. Susan, do you have any favorite questions from the chat?
Well, I have my own question, but you haven't talked about money at all aside from the $100. And I know that's the stereotype of, big, heavy packets of money exchanging hands. And Em said how, you're supposed to record that. Is that true? Does that happen much in New Hampshire? If it does, is there some way to make sure the public knows it's going on?
Sure. Yeah, so the state provides lawmakers with $100 for their time. And then, I think campaigns cost money. And so elected officials in New Hampshire are no different than elected officials anywhere else in the country, is that they need to raise money in order to run campaigns for re-election or really re-election, because they wouldn't be elected first. So a few things. So all campaigns have mandatory reporting requirements. And so you can go back to the Secretary of State's webpage, and you can go onto their campaigns, and you could go look for anybody who has filed to run for statewide office. And it goes back many years, and you could look at their financial statements, and you have to report. I might get this wrong, so I don't want to say it, but you have to report both the dollar amount that you've been given, and then for dollar amounts over a certain amount, you got to record the individual contributor's address and then their employment situation. And then there are campaign finance limits here in New Hampshire for how much a elected official can take from an individual contributor. And so lobbyists do play a role in campaign financing. And so, there are fundraisers here in Concord set up during the course of the year that anybody can go to, lobbyists go to, some lobbyists go to as a cost of doing business. And so it's another way that lobbyists interact with elected officials. And again, it is recorded on Secretary of State's website, so those contributions and who's giving them are all accessible.
So you have a budget, a slush fund budget for how much you can hand out?
So the Nature Conservancy, like many nonprofits, we don't engage in fundraising. So we do not participate as an organization, and as individual lobbyists, we don't participate in fundraisers for elected officials.
Okay, I mean, that's a whole other huge topic. Christine Baber wanted to know